All right, well, let's get started here and we'll keep it moving along, and hopefully our speaker will be here in just a minute. But welcome everyone. I am Jenny McKellar. I'm the program director here at Change Chemistry. I think I know most of you on the line, but for those of you who haven't met yet, welcome. We're really excited about the new name. This is the most updated logo that we have, and for those of you who have seen the emails, we are going through a rebrand. So we're moving from GC3, which we have been for the last 15 or so years, and moving towards Change Chemistry. We really felt like this name better embraced what we're trying to do as an organization, which is change chemistry. We have some great upcoming webinars as well. We have a Innovation Expo coming up at the end of this month. This is a great place for you as members to showcase what your organization is all about. If you're interested in participating, please let me know. We do still have some rooms available. This is a virtual, basically an exhibition hall. You're able to come and share about a recent innovation in the green and sustainable chemistry space. So each of the organizations will have their own room, and we'll have members coming in and talking with you throughout the 2-hour event. So if you're interested in participating, please do let me know. You can register to come as an attendee, and if you're interested in presenting, we do still have some space available, so just let me know. Coming up in May, we have some really exciting webinars happening. We have a really interesting and engaging webinar that we'll be doing with the Environmental Protection Agency about best practices around environmental justice. So we'll be talking about various attributes of sustainable justice and how companies can take a more practical approach to considering their environmental justice impacts in the communities where they are manufacturing and working. At the end of May, we'll be doing a webinar with ChemForward and Apple on a solvent selection tool that's available in the ChemForward database to help folks choose more lower VOC solvents. So hopefully you'll be able to attend that webinar as well. And then on June 7th, we'll be doing a presentation with the Swedish Research Institute on the implementation of the Safe and Sustainable by Design framework. So we'll be talking through some practical tools that can be used in an industrial setting for the application of the implementation of the Safe and Sustainable by Design framework, which is a European framework. Slide, please. So, for those of you who haven't seen yet, we are having our European Forum taking place June 13th to 15th in Leverkusen, Germany. Registration for non-members opens today, but members can still get in there and get your tickets today if you are interested in joining us or able to. If you have colleagues in Europe that you think would be interested, please either shoot me an email with their contact information. I'm happy to reach out, or send information along to them as well. We hope to see you there. In November this year, we will be having our annual Innovators Roundtable taking place November 14th to 16th in St. Louis, Missouri. Will be hosted by MilliporeSigma this year. We are currently in the process of putting together the agenda for this event and looking for interesting topics. So if there are topics that you think would be particularly relevant or important for us to be discussing, please do let me know. If you're interested in attending or sponsoring, of course, we're always happy to have that conversation. So please do let me know, and hopefully we'll see you there. All right, today's speaker is from Eastman. We have Daan here to talk with us about the importance of replacing a more dangerous solvent before there was really regulatory pressure to do so. I think this is a really interesting topic here at GC3 because solvents are such a huge impact on all industrial production. So it's really interesting to hear about the adoption of more sustainable solvents and the implications of doing this before there are true market drivers from regulatory pressure. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Daan. Thanks for being here today, Daan. Look forward to hearing your presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny, for the introduction and allowing me or Eastman to talk about The solvent we have introduced a couple of years ago, or almost 10 years ago these days, ahead of regulatory regulations or regulatory pressures. Let's start with putting some context of Eastman developing a sustainable or safer solvent to have an answer to N-methylpyridone, NMP, that was classified as a class 1B reprotoxic chemical. In 2007, basically, the EU adopted the REACH regulation. I think that was a shockwave for the European chemical industry. There was a lot documented, and I think chemicals were tested for their toxicity, etc. But nothing was really all grouped together. So with launching or starting REACH, basically that changed how the European good and for bad. That's always when you go and drive for a change. For NMP, it basically meant that okay, now here we have all these toxicity studies, and we look at the molecule and say, you know what, hey, this is not a healthy molecule. We need to go and regulate, right? That is the in essence the start of REACH. I think we'll see similar developments actually in other places in the world. I think in the US you had your in 2016 the Lautenberger Act, which is basically also allowing the governments to start regulating chemicals and get some grip on working with chemicals in a safe and healthy way. So in 2009, that's basically when the journey started. NMP was classified, and then you come into what I would say a vacuum between policy makers in Brussels in our case and the legislators, trying to think, okay, great, but what does that actually mean? Initially, you get a lot of traction, people get nervous, what does that mean, etc. And then all of a sudden, there's a vacuum to move. Why myself NXG as an alternative to NMP? Basically, around 2012, we started the development work and launching it early 2014 as an alternative. And then you say, okay, how do you going to bring it to market, right? Because really, people didn't feel the urge to change to NMP. Said, well, we've seen that with REACH, it can take ages. They were partly right. It does take ages to get a molecule regulated because in Europe, at least, there's a number of member states that all have to give their buy-in to what are we regulated. They all have different interest there, depending on to what extent that chemical is used in their country. But that's basically when the journey started. Now, being in the chemical industry for a couple of decades, I haven't seen any industry taking a truly proactive stance in, okay, you know what, this is what's at risk. Let's have a discussion on what is the future going to look like if these molecules are going to be further regulated. Right, and further regulation basically in Europe and it means restriction or authorization. Where restriction is you can use it, but you have to meet certain exposure limits. Authorization basically means you can't use it, and if you want to use it, you have to file for an exemption, and that's a very costly process. Can you all still hear me? Because I got a message that the internet is unstable.
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So developing a new solvent for a solvent that's there for a long time is a challenge. You could argue, well, if it was NMP is known to be a very potent chemical, but also has health risks. Try and develop an alternative there, right? So that's a good challenge because we are taking, the chemical industry is I would say, taking let's say a passive approach here. So you come in with something new to say, yeah, well, what do I need to change? Oh, that's going to be a lot of work, and so that's basically how it's perceived if you want to come with a new alternative. Nevertheless, Eastman continued to do its work and launch it, meeting a couple of key criteria. I mean, it's a solvent, so it needs to be liquid. It had to be biodegradable because NMP is biodegradable. Um, it had to be water soluble. It had to be the same potency as NMP if you come with it as an alternative. So that's basically what we've done, launching it mainly in Europe because that's where the first drivers were. And then we went out. And basically, you start with thinking about applications, markets, drivers, etc. Try and understand that need. I mean, the driver is regulatory, but regulatory is only as strong as regulations come into place, and as long as they're out there, but nothing is known, and there's no sunset dates known, nothing will really happen. At least that's the learning that we had. Application-driven push to a more awareness, where we basically try to create a broader audience within our customer base, to get them an understanding. Hey, you need to change, right? And if you don't do it, ultimately someone will do it for you. And that drove the adoption of NMP or of NXG over NMP, not only for NMP, but also to a lot of other solvents. I would say typical approaches are let's create nice brochures with nice pictures here, and then send it out. And at least you have to get some entertainment to get people attracted to it, to basically get it on the bench of formulators. So you need to show it's novel, new, it has some potential there to be a truly safer alternative. That's what we did. You can see here as an example, just nice graphs. I mean, you can look at timesolvenxg.com. There's more information there on different applications. But for the purpose here, it's all about how do you go to market. And yes, we focus on application. Meaning you talk to formulators, you talk to development chemists, to researchers. And usually if it's a commercial, if it's a customer, you also have on one side the formulator and the researcher, and on the other side you have procurement, usually being the watchdog. Hey, what's going on here? Because I do have my budget, right? And I also want to have a lean setup, don't have too much alternative chemicals here. So that's how we started. And I have to say, coming in with something new and exciting, you're using European coding, so you get immediately a lot of traction. We couldn't find enough basically samples to get it out of the door on time, and people loved the concept. Hey, there's finally something that is an alternative to NMP. Not saying there are no other alternative, but this is a alternative and looks to have nice attributes. So you get a lot of sample requests, and then a second wave of sample requests, another wave of sample requests, and then suddenly it starts to die out. Then you say, that's not gonna go in the right direction. What's happening? I mean, clearly, I mean, everyone wants NMP to be replaced or not. And that's basically where we ran into the discussions with the chemists. They said, yeah, well, I tested it. Really, it's not priority. I said, not priority, what do you mean? I mean, the NMP is going to be regulated. Yeah, but the assessment from our regulatory department is it's going to take a while. So basically, they shifted priorities. You start off with a good flow of samples, so I think it's going to be off to a good start, and then it basically stops. And that's when you actually start out to prove it's working, right? and it has good potential, but it's not moving. And then we went basically to say, okay, let's take a step back and try and understand how we can engage a little bit more, because basically we have this application data available for the development, excuse me, for the development chemists, but someone else needs to buy in, right? So usually that's regulatory and product development are linked close together, but ultimately the company needs to adopt it, right? And that's basically when we move to the step that put it in a broader context and see that we get that awareness and get people to actually start to think differently, in the sense that something needs to happen because it's truly there. So good. So that's when we start to put it into a broader context and took basically our customers by the hand and explained them how does the regulatory bodies, how do they look at solvents in general, and particular NMP? Because NMP is part of a class of dipolar product solvents. They all have very strong or are very potent solvents, and have similarities. They're all water soluble, they're all biodegradable, and basically very versatile. But because they're so versatile and so potent, they also are a risk for human health if you have long-term exposure, because the whole focus here is not the short-term exposure as such, but more the chronic exposure to a solvent. Solvents are actually used in applications that you can find off the shelf, the DIY shops. So that even with consumers having less education, they don't know if they read labels. What is that? What is that dead fish, that tree means, right? What is that man with the exploding chest? What is that? They read it, say, yeah, it's going to be okay. But actually, it's not okay. You need to understand what you're reading, right? And we only have so much text that you can put on it, and there will be no company that will write it out that it's not so not so safe to use, or there's certain risks. So let's frame it and then tell take our customers by the hand and say, you know what? If we look at these solvents, this class of solvents, this dipolar product solvents, actually ECHA and the European Union has a very clear focus and a clear goal. They basically want to regulate or restrict all these solvents. They start off with NMP. Right, and then the other ones will follow. There's a couple of reasons. Some of them are political, and it also depends on which member state drives the restriction dossier. Not all member states are active, but in this case, they started off with NMP, and like I said, it's hot, the topic. You get classified as a substance of very high concern. Meaning there's evidence, scientific evidence that is actually bad for the human health. But then what's next? And yes, it took a while, right? And we kept continuing to promote it. But once we basically set this landscape for our customers, it was like, okay, now we understand this is not just NMP. It is not one formulation that the chemist was trying to resolve or to find an answer for, or something novel. No, the industry is changing. And what is changing in the industry? That's basically when we started off with REACH, and I think the Lautenberger Act in the US is an analog to that. You will basically say, you know what? People don't buy, yeah, the chemistry is safe, right? If there were plants in the past, there were all kinds of emissions, people really didn't know, and as long as people say it's safe, then it's safe. But now, these days, people don't buy that anymore. There's a lot of information available in the public domain. True or not true, that's always the question these days, but there's a lot of information, so people actually can start and challenge that, and we start to think more about the future of ourselves and of the generations to come. That is driving this. And if you put that, when we put this into context, people said, okay, now we understand. But then we started in 14. NMP only got restricted in 2019. So that took almost 10 years. And then you say, yeah, you know what, DMF is going to do the same. And they said, no. DMF is not going to do the same. NMP was the first one to go, and the other ones will follow soon. And yes, indeed, DMF is restricted as well now, and DMSC is the next one to come, probably within the next year or 2 years. But basically, it's known what the industry will be doing. So by putting this into context, then you create a broader audience. I think that's one of the keys for us to really get that momentum. Formulator anymore, or the R&D chemist. We looked at the regulatory folks, and we looked at the business owners and say, hey, if this is what the public is thinking, maybe you start to think through your supply chain in where does that molecule go to, in this case, NMP. And then we start to talk to companies that actually make coatings that end up in consumers. Now, the coatings by themselves probably don't have NMP, but basically with all the fuss that's about chemicals that are bad. I mean, I was calling the Monsanto piece where you basically say, well, scientifically there's nothing, yet the claims are there. Maybe they're not all substantiated, but some of them are. It's out there, and you have a choice now as a company or as a brand to drive a change here and to replace NMP in your formulation with a safer solvent. And then basically you have less questions to answer, because the problem with these solvents is and that people will ask more. And I think there's no level playing field anymore. People can throw things on the internet. I think we have seen that, was it 2-3 years ago, when Lowe's took their paint removers off the shelves. Sherwin-Williams stopped producing them. So that movement is there. Here, look at Tamisolve. It's an alternative for NMP. But by having that discussion, people were actually thinking, hold on, this is a little bit, it goes beyond, because I have also other solvents out there. So what does my next generation look like? And that's always how we focused on Tamisolve. Yeah, you can have some quick wins, but it's also about next generation solutions that you will provide to the industry. So by putting it slightly different, we basically broadened the audience, and we got way more buy-in, and also projects actually to move on. Because in all the R&D work ongoing, it's always, oh, there's so much work and project here and firefighting there. But you really need to get it on the minds of people. And that means that you need to get it broad buy-in from stakeholders actually do take the decision to make a shift from away from NMP or any other bad chemical that you want to replace. That's one. So we got that audience, and then the next step is, okay, the countries have all kinds of inventories, and you want to broaden your footprint. So for Europe, we had our REACH registration, and then we which actually went, I would say, quite nicely. A lot of, I mean, the majority, I would say, is still scientific driven. There's a couple of exemptions. If you want to go to China and Japan, they have specific ecotox requirements that you have to do some testing on. Fine, so that's additional testing. So basically, our approval went quite reasonable, with the exception of the US EPA. That's basically the one that we have challenges with, where I would say that where the others you talk about science, here it seems to be linked to who's dealing with your dossier, or in what working group are you, to get the right attention. I mean, the feedback time is long. or the clock is extended all the time. So really, that is a big challenge, and it still is. I think we make good progress, but we still are challenged with the EPA to get the right traction, which is equally. I mean, it's disappointing if you want to move, but for the good reasons. That is something that we have to work through. But again, changing here the traditional thinking from going to application, try and broaden your audience, put the big picture out there, and yet you'll, I mean, that's where we got the traction to get them from reactive to proactive. And I have to say we're very pleased with how TimeSolve is evolving. And we continue to keep traction. And I think that's there to stay. Like I said, we're broadening it. It's not only NMP. We see people thinking about it to replace DMF and DMAC, even if it requires a lot of reformulation work, but I still think it's the better for the future. And then we have, oh yeah, I'm going to be different. I'm not going to talk about price setting here, but I would always challenge people to start thinking about your total value chain, right? So I'll refer to a conversation I had with a company that said, yeah, you know what, it's expensive and that's not doable for us. I said, so what's your alternative? Because you can't expand where you are now because you're close to where people live actually, and you don't get your permits in place. So you have to do something to change. And then they start to think, hey, okay, so what does it mean? I mean, the cost to change is about what is the alternative that you have. And they actually start to think through and then say, okay, here we understand it's not about the price per kilo, it's actually about the total cost for change. And I think that's where the power is for these solutions. Or when you try and launch a new product, there's always uncertainty, I understand. But here's where we really start to see the change by, first of all, putting it in other context, general public, that people will want to see the change, also from the chemical companies, and then getting the approvals, which is obviously something that you can't speed up too much. I mean, there's certain processes you have to stick to. That's basically what I had to share, and I'm more than happy to have a conversation or answer any questions you may have.
Great, thanks, Daan. This is really helpful. Looks like we have a question from Art. Go ahead, Art.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan. Excellent presentation. I have two questions. One is, how does Eastman show that in fact the alternative is safer than NMP? Did you go through some kind of chemical hazard assessment framework such as Green Screen or Chem Forward? And the second question is, on the coatings, yeah, I understand. Actually, it's pretty easy to see why it would work as a viable alternative. But the main critical use of NMP is, in fact, in semiconductor manufacturing. Have you connected with, meaning Eastman, connected with the semiconductor industry to see if, in fact, NMP would work for semiconductor manufacturing? And again, that's the critical use. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so Art, I think we didn't go through those extensive screening or the two systems that you refer to. What we basically say, okay, what is the potential or what's the classification for NMP? Yeah? What's the human health concern? And we basically went through all the OECD studies that you have to do to prove it's a safer alternative. I mean, it remains a chemical, right? That's not that's always the case. But basically, all the studies that we've done, and they're now part of our REACH dossier, we went all through all the developmental studies because that's the concern to prove it's safe. It's a safer alternative, right? I mean, it's not developmental toxic. So that's one. And
so just want to offer or say that if you're interested in putting this solvent through the CAM Forward chemical hazard assessment framework, if we can make that happen. If you just need to have the tox data that you mentioned, and also ideally the chemical structure or identity such that in where there are gaps in the tox data, we can use structure activity calculations to get an estimate of the different hazard endpoints. So that's a possibility if you're interested in that.
That, I mean, it's something to consider for sure. But so far, we stick to the real the developmental toxicity studies that actually are required for your REACH registration, but also for registration to other countries, right?
Right.
Then your question on semiconductors. Yes, Eastman
yes.
is looking in the semiconductor space for Thymosolv NXG as an alternative to NMP. I have to say that the coatings is maybe a quick win, right? Because that's where the more exposure is. Because basically, it's all about exposure to consumers, right? How far you go down the chain. But in the clean rooms, yes, we have looked at that, and yes, we are engaging on Thymosolv as an alternative to NMP in the semiconductor industry. So there's some basic work done without disclosing too much, but there's basic work done in the battery manufacturing and in the electronic circuit board.
And again, if you need contacts with in the semiconductor industry, let me know. I am part of several, I think, Semiconductor Industry Association, EHS working group. So if you need connections, please let me know. And again, really enjoy your presentation.
I will, and I appreciate your you reaching out, offering help.
Thanks, Art.
Joel,
go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Daan. This is great. So my question relates to thinking through, we've talked with Scott and John, who are on the call, about the Omnia experience. And if you can, which has been a challenge, right? Can you talk a little bit about the difference of the experience with Thymosolv versus Omnia in thinking about markets? I mean, the change chemistry, focus is really how do we grow commercialization and scale of more sustainable alternatives. And we know solvents, despite, John and I were talking about this last week, despite all this work in safer solvents, we're still, there's a New York Times article about the EPA's new restrictions on several, and just the pushback that's happening, despite the growth, right? We know they exist. Why are they not getting scale in, I mean, on NMP, right, there's a regulatory driver, but where there's not a regulatory driver, what do we have to do? Because this is where change chemistry really wants to go, is how do we sort of shift the whole market towards more sustainable solvents?
Yeah,
so
maybe so.
From your perspective on that would be great.
Nah, so I wasn't participating too much in the Omnia piece, so Joel, that's hard for me to comment. I think on Omnia, or the only thing I would say, I think there's analogies in being a safer solvent, using a lot of application data to prove it, without maybe an underlying immediate need to look for a replacement. And there may be some technical challenges, right? That's what we had to. We have to overcome those challenges. The only one thing I have been advocating when we saw that those nice brochures give you basically only a seat to the table, because that's what it is. The first comment I said, if you want to do a drop-in, then forget about it. It's not going to work. So you need to be willing to reformulate. You need to be willing to understand what you need, what the driver is to make a change, right? And I think, again, for Omnia, I wasn't too heavily involved. I know John was probably more involved because I'm based in Europe, and Omnia is not so. the main differences in learnings. I think I stepped away. I mean, I've been leading the Time is Solve introduction for the past 7-8 years. We basically stepped away from telling our customers how to work with the molecule. I think that and then basically with the regulatory driver was there, that was way stronger, but not trying to say this is what you need to use. Is probably equally powerful to the regulatory push that's there to make changes.
Good.
And Don, I can jump in to help. It's vastly different between Tamisolve replacing NMP and Omnia. In the case of Tamisolve, we were guilty until proven innocent. So we actually stepped back and did a lot of additional data. To Art's point, we didn't go to those green screening programs because we actually did a lot of data. In fact, we've been told by some regulators we have more data than NMP has now for toxicology. So we chose to go the science route and did the extra work on that. But again, it was, guilty until proven innocent. Instead of with Omnia, it was from the very beginning, not tying it to a substance that had a negative issue. And so it had a clean start from the beginning.
Thank you. It looks like we have another question from Pamela. Pamela, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So Dan, thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. Art actually asked my questions, but I just wanted to chime in and introduce myself. I'm the Senior Director of the Clean Electronics Production Network, and we have a list of priority chemicals for elimination, substitution in the electronics industry. And NNP is one of those in our first round of priority chemicals. We do have an exemption for photoresist stripping in the semiconductor industry. So, just to chime in for Art, that is of particular interest to us and the folks in our network is finding a replacement to that. And then I'd also just again like to echo Art is that if you've done all of this scientific work running the product through Chem Forward, really would give it an ability to be promoted in maybe a different route. And we have on our website products that have been certified by various assessment schemes, and we would love to showcase your product if and when that happens. So thank you.
Thanks, Pamela. Dawn, I have a question for you about the sites where you manufacture this new alternative versus where it's used. And can you talk a little bit about how that's working? Are you manufacturing close to sites where the solvent is used, or are you having to transport across large distances to get to places where the solvent is actually being used?
Good question, Jenny. That's because I think part of the success is how sustainable can you set a chain and how lean Gantt, right? It's a little chicken and the egg discussion to start off. You don't start to build a new site if you don't have developed the market, right? So basically, we're manufacturing it in Ghent and ship it across the world. We have logistic hubs there where we keep local storage to reduce the lead times and as much as possible. But yeah, there's still, if you look at from a footprint perspective, that's still a challenge. Nevertheless, this is how you start. I think there's always ways to look at, okay, let's go and see if there's enough demand that you can consider developing manufacturing capabilities closer to the sources, right? Because now we have to basically ship it across the ocean to the US. Okay, ideally you want to consider making it in the US or in any other region. And that's the challenge for us. I mean, that's also how we have discussed it with customers, because they say, yeah, what is it? Because you still have only one manufacturing site. The last 2 years, thanks, John. The last 2 years, people know what the exposure is if you don't get your replenishment on time, right? But so far we have managed to work through that, to continue with I would say, our customer base, to keep the supply chain going as much as possible. And we're proud to say that we have not let any customer down in the period of COVID.
Thanks, Daan. Other questions?
No, nothing online or send a chat.
Great. Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you,
Nope.
Daan, for taking the time here today to share the information that you have. This has been a really interesting presentation, and I'm glad we had some really great discussions here. If you have additional questions for Daan or the GC3, please do reach out to us. We're happy to engage anywhere along the conversation. So thanks, everyone, and we will give you back almost 15 minutes in your day today. So thanks again, Daan, and we will see you all soon.
I think if there's any later questions, you will collect them and send them over to Scott or to John. I mean, maybe people will listen to the playback or whatever.
Absolutely, yes.
And
We
I
have-
appreciate the help and the suggestions here to get more traction, maybe particular segments.
Thanks so
Alright.
much all. Have a great day, and we will see you at the next webinar. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny.